Hi friends, a warm hello from Columbus, Ohio. First and foremost, I'm incredibly uncomfortable on videoing, and so grace to me. I'm going to thank you in advance for your grace. Let's do this thing. Also, a huge shout out to my sweet team. Want to be so kind and generous of them to let me hop on this presentation in this way, and so to all, thank you so much. Also, I'll be giving Juliet a few cues to switch slides, and so again, roll with me. So I'll just start right into it. And so chapter 5 is all about this idea of self-seeing. And so a major theme throughout this chapter is this idea of how we view ourselves and the way that we understand ourselves affects the way that we view others and affects the way that we identify others. And so Labberton starts off this chapter, Juliet, this is the next slide, by saying, "My sense of myself in the world was marked by deep insecurity and personal deficiency. This led me to feel that my life was about overcoming my inadequacies, trying to fill the gaps, trying to hide or make up for what I wasn't, trying to succeed by success, which of course didn't work. This false sense of myself meant that in the process I came to see others falsely too." I'm going to read that last sentence again. "This false sense of myself meant that in the process I came to see others falsely too." So this quotation comes out of his conversation about how he grew up feeling really inadequate, and he would see these prominent people, he would see these confident people, and he would wonder to himself, I wonder if they believe themselves to be confident. I wonder if they believe themselves to be successful. And so he makes this connection that the way that we understand ourselves affects the way that we view others. And so I made a connection point, this is the next slide, Juliet, of like how this affects us as leaders. And so first and foremost, I think it's wise and important for us to know how we view ourselves. And so it is important for me to understand who is Meg Van Ryn. Blair, it is important for you to understand who is Blair Lewis. And Josiah, it is important for you to understand who is Josiah. And then we take it a step further and how it is so wise of us to know who our followers understand themselves to be. And so, for example, I can feed positive affirmation to my followers all day long, but unless they believe my words to be true, they will never be able to receive that positive affirmation. And so I think a big connection point we can receive from this in the context of leadership is that it's wise for us to know how we view ourselves, understand and put the work to know how others, those who are leading, understand themselves, and then lead out of that perspective. So next, the conversation, this is the next slide, leads this idea of mirrors. And so the big question that I pose to you is, who do you tell others they are when they are in relationship with you? And so there's this idea that we reflect an image back to people based on the way that we interact with them. And so a tangible example of this is this idea of people who are experiencing homelessness. And so people who are experiencing homelessness, when they view common people in society, they are told back that they are hopeless, that they are not worth attention, they're not worth time. And so this, every time they look up for affirmation or they look to people for relationship, that often is the stereotype they are received. Like, you are worthless, you are not worthy of our time or attention, therefore we're going to pass you by. And so Labberton makes this connection with, how do we expect people to operate specific ways if we are always feeding them a specific negative image? And this story, or this idea, is brought home with the story of Joseph. And so Joseph was fed the image that he was not worth time, not worth attention, so far so that he was sold into slavery by his brothers. And so he could have believed first off, the image that his family fed him, and second, the image that society was feeding him, that he was a slave. But rather, he chose to believe the image that the Lord reflected back to him. And this brings home this idea that we first and foremost need to view ourselves through the lens of God and knowing, who does God say that I am? Because that is the only reflection of myself that I care about, and that's the only reflection of myself that I need to take to heart. And so Joseph is a great example of a man who operated out of the Lord's reflection of him, and now he's remembered as a prominent biblical character. So again, this whole main point is to be conscious and be aware of the reflections that we are giving back to people with our language and with the way that we speak to them and our nonverbals and the titles that we choose to operate out of. And so this whole big idea is, what is the mirror that you are feeding people? And then the next slide, Juliet, it's the idea about a social awareness bell curve. And so Labberton talks about this idea of a bell curve and how there are people in society who fit the majority for us, the people that we pay attention to, the people that stand out to us, and the people that receive our time and effort. And then there are people that we associate as the outside of our bell curve, meaning they are unworthy of my time and will never receive my attention because they are outside the social context that I'm aware of. And so Labberton just talks about how when we have a false idea of ourselves and a false idea of those around us, social injustice occurs because there are people who are left outside of the bell curve and who are left on the outside because people are not willing to step out of their own image and step out of their own social awareness to get to know people who are outside the curve. And so this quotation, or this quote, Juliet, next slide. This closing quotation says, "If we cannot see ourselves, we're going to be all the more distorted in our vision of our neighbor and of God." So really, this book is about the dangerous act of loving your neighbor, and this chapter just talks about how, in order to love our neighbors well, we need to first understand who we are. And so I think the challenge to me and to all of us is, how can we look to the Lord to describe and define ourselves, knowing that it is out of that vision that we'll be able to It is out of that image that we'll be able to extend grace and extend love and extend care for those who are outside our bell curve, or to those who have a distorted image in society. And so I think this chapter is just really key and is a huge part of this idea of self-seeing. And so thank you. That is all that I have for this time. And go team, you got this.